Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we are diving straight into one of the most highly scrutinized, high-stakes areas in corporate sustainability today, greenhouse gas emission reporting under IFRS S2. Now, if you think categorizing emissions is just some simple box-ticking exercise, you are definitely in for a surprise. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into a really fascinating case study, a large automobile manufacturer named VoltEdge Motors, or VM for short. We'll be using their scenario, specifically focusing on question 4 and common candidate errors noted by examiners to completely untangle the complex web of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
But before we get into the weeds, I've got a question for you. Do you own your emissions once a product is actually sold? Think about it. If you build a car, hand over the keys, and fully transfer the legal title to a customer, are you still responsible for the carbon coming out of that tailpipe for the next 15 years? Just keep that in the back of your mind, because the answer fundamentally changes how we have to view corporate responsibility.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. Section 1, the GHG Classification Challenge. 2, Scope 1, Direct Operations. 3, Scope 2, the Cost Trap. 4, Scope 3, Upstream. 5, Scope 3, Downstream. And finally, 6, Key Takeaways and Exam Tips.
All right, Section 1, the GHG Classification Challenge. The reality is, distinguishing between direct and indirect emissions trips up even the absolute most prepared professionals.
Just to make sure we're all starting from the exact same baseline, let's look at this brilliantly simple breakdown. Under the GHG protocol in IFRS S2, Scope 1 covers your direct operations, so emissions from sources that you own or control. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions from purchased energy. Think electricity you buy but don't actually generate yourself. And then Scope 3 covers everything else in your value chain, both upstream suppliers and downstream customers. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, as we're going to see with VoltEdge Motors, management teams constantly get this wrong. If you want proof of just how tricky this gets, we can look at a direct quote from the examiner's comments regarding the recent sustainability reporting exam, where this exact VM scenario was tested. Look at that list. Candidates completely misclassified supplier blast furnaces, natural gas, refrigerant leaks, and end-of-life treatments. This right here is a massive red flag. If you're preparing for these disclosures, these are the exact areas where points are lost and material misstatements are made.
Moving right along to Section 2, Scope 1, Direct Operations. Let's break down exactly where the confusion starts. So, looking at VEM's manufacturing plants, management's position was that natural gas used in their manufacturing furnaces and kilns is a Scope 1 emission. And in this specific case, when comparing that to IFRS S2 reality, management actually got it right. Why? Because the combustion of that natural gas happens inside a physical facility that VEM owns and controls. That establishes our baseline rule. Operational control over the physical combustion source equals Scope 1. But hold on, because that logic completely falls apart when we introduce a different gas. VM's management noticed HFC refrigerants leaking from their plant air conditioning units, and they tried to argue these should just be excluded. Their reasoning? HFC isn't CO2, and the physical volume of the leak is insignificant. But the IFRS S2 reality exposes this as a massive candidate trap. IFRS S2 mandates the reporting of all Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide.
Let's break down the actual reality check here so you don't fall into this exact same trap. Step 1. Does the leak happen in an owned plant? Yes, the AC units are sitting right there in VEM's facility, meaning it is definitively a direct Scope 1 emission. Step 2. HFCs are Kyoto Protocol gases, so they absolutely must be reported. And Step 3, which is the absolutely crucial point, you cannot judge materiality by just looking at the raw physical volume of a gas. You have to convert that volume into its CO2 equivalent, or CO2e. Because HFCs trap vastly more heat than CO2, a tiny physical leak can have a massive CO2e impact. Management's claim of insignificance was completely unreliable because they skipped that conversion.
Okay, that brings us to Section 3, Scope 2, and what I like to call the cost trap.
Let's look at electricity. VEM purchases electricity to run its assembly lines and keep the factory lights on. Management looked at their accounting books, saw that electricity is categorized as a direct cost of manufacturing, and decided, great, that makes it a Scope 1 direct emission. But under IFRS S2, this is a fundamental candidate error. They are completely conflating management accounting with GHG accounting.
Here is the golden rule you absolutely need to remember. GHG directness refers to physical location, not product costing classifications. Think about it.
VEM does not burn the coal or natural gas to generate that electricity, right? They just consume the power that was already generated somewhere else by a utility company. Because the actual combustion happens off-site at a third-party power plant, it is an indirect emission, which firmly places it in Scope 2.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Scope 3 and the upstream control fallacy. We're stepping outside VAM's factory gates now to tackle the area where management teams always try to wash their hands of emissions. VAM buys raw materials from independent suppliers who operate these heavy-emitting blast furnaces. Management tries to argue, hey, we don't own those furnaces, and we don't control them, so we are excluding them. But the IFRS S2 reality tells a completely different story. Lacking operational control is not an excuse to exclude an emission. In fact, it's precisely the definition of a Scope 3 emission. These emissions occur outside the entity's operational boundary, but squarely within its value chain. Therefore, they fall under upstream Scope 3, specifically Category 1, purchased goods and services.
Ultimately, the reality of upstream Scope 3 is that lack of control is the defining feature, not a loophole. Supplier emissions are Category 1. And what about the third-party logistics trucks distributing VEM's vehicles? It's the exact same story. VEM doesn't own those trucks, but if VEM purchases the transport service, that's Scope 3, Category 4. If the dealer or the customer pays for the transport, it's Scope 3, Category 9. The bottom line? Anything happening in your value chain has to be accounted for.
All right, Section 5, Scope 3, downstream responsibility. What happens when the vehicle actually leaves VM's hands?
Remember that question I asked you at the very beginning of this explainer? VEM's management assumed that because 85% of their vehicles are internal combustion engines, once the customer buys the car and takes the legal title, well, the emissions belong to the customer now. But the IFRS S2 reality crushes this myth. Legal ownership does not erase value chain attribution. Think about it. VEM's engineers determine the fuel type, they determine the engine efficiency, and ultimately the lifetime emissions profile of that vehicle. Because of those design choices, the use phase emissions remain entirely in VEM's downstream value chain under Scope 3, Category 11, use of sold products.
And guess what? It doesn't even stop when the car stops running. Looking back at those examiner's comments we brought up earlier, end-of-life vehicle treatment is another massive pitfall for reporting entities.
When a car is finally scrapped, dismantled, or its EV battery is disposed of, VEM basically argued, well, we don't have contracts with these random scrapyards, so the data is way too uncertain to report. They chose silence. But the IFRS S2 reality requires transparency. A manufacturer bears the lifetime footprint of a product, period. This means Scope 3, Category 12, end-of-life treatment must be reported. Providing an estimated figure while clearly disclosing your methodology and uncertainty range is far more decision useful to an investor than just pretending those emissions don't exist. You simply cannot use uncertainty as a shield.
Finally, Section 6, Key Takeaways and Exam Tips. Let's lock in these concepts.
I highly recommend taking a mental screenshot of this master cheat sheet because it definitively maps out all 7 of VEM's emission sources, so you can dodge those common candidate errors we talked about. Natural gas and HFC leaks? Those are definitively Scope 1. They fall under direct operational control. Purchased electricity? That is Scope 2, indirect, regardless of what your cost accounting says. Supplier blast furnaces? Scope 3, Category 1. Third-party logistics? Scope 3, Category 4 or 9 depending on who pays. The actual use of the sold vehicles? Scope 3, Category 11. And finally, end-of-life scrapping? Scope 3, Category 12. Having this exact structure mapped out in your head is absolutely the key to mastering GHG disclosures.
To wrap this all up, remember these 3 golden rules. 1. Scope 1 is entirely about the physical location of combustion, not how it's classified in an accounting ledger. 2. Control fallacies do not excuse Scope 3. In fact, being outside your operational boundary but inside your value chain is exactly what Scope 3 is. And 3. Transferring legal ownership of a product does not erase your responsibility for its lifetime footprint. I'll leave you with this one final provocative thought. Take a really close look at your own organization's sustainability disclosures. Is your company using a perceived lack of control as a convenient excuse to hide its true carbon footprint? Because under IFRS S2, that excuse just doesn't fly anymore. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you now feel fully equipped to crack the GHG code.